Queen Isabella adjusted her pearl necklace nervously as she stood before the ornate mirror in her private chambers. Today was the annual Royal Literary Festival at Thornbury Palace, and she had promised to deliver the opening speech. The problem was that she had completely forgotten about it until her private secretary, Mrs. Pemberton, had rushed in that morning with a panicked expression. "Your Majesty, the speech notes are nowhere to be found," Mrs. Pemberton had announced breathlessly. "And Dame Victoria Ashworth, the famous romance novelist, is already here for the ceremony." Queen Isabella had nodded calmly, though inside she felt anything but calm. Dame Victoria Ashworth was beloved across the kingdom for her witty romance novels featuring dashing heroes and independent heroines. The Queen had read every single one, often hiding the books behind more serious literature when the royal photographers came calling. She particularly loved The Countess and The Stable Boy, and had once spent an entire afternoon reading Passion at Pembroke Manor when she should have been reviewing trade agreements. The Queen made her way through the palace corridors, her heels clicking against the marble floors. Portraits of her ancestors looked down at her with stern expressions, as if they were judging her for her literary preferences. She passed the blue drawing room, where she could hear the gentle murmur of guests arriving for the festival. Dame Victoria Ashworth was already mingling with the crowd, her silver hair perfectly styled and her eyes twinkling with mischief. She wore a flowing purple dress that seemed to match her vibrant personality. The Queen had met her several times before, but always in formal settings where conversation was limited to pleasantries about the weather and charitable endeavors. As Queen Isabella entered the grand ballroom where the ceremony would take place, she noticed the elaborate decorations. Golden banners hung from the ceiling, and tables were laden with copies of books by various authors who would be honored today. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases, and the palace staff had outdone themselves with the arrangements. Lord Chamberlain Henry Fitzwilliam approached the Queen with his usual formal bow. "Your Majesty, we are ready to begin whenever you are prepared to deliver your opening remarks." The Queen's heart skipped a beat. She still had no speech prepared, and in less than 10 minutes, she would be expected to address the distinguished guests about the importance of literature in the kingdom. She glanced around the room, trying to think of something appropriate to say. Dame Victoria appeared at her side, as if sensing the Queen's distress. "Your Majesty, you look absolutely radiant today. I do hope you've had a chance to read my latest novel. I took some rather bold creative liberties with the historical accuracy, but I think readers will forgive me for the sake of romance." Queen Isabella smiled, grateful for the distraction. "Dame Victoria, I must confess I have read all of your books, though I probably shouldn't admit that publicly. Your characters always seem so real, so full of life and passion." Dame Victoria's eyes lit up with delight. "How wonderful. You know, I base many of my characters on real people I've encountered over the years. Some of my most outrageous scenes actually happened to people I know, though I changed the names to protect the innocent, of course." The Queen found herself genuinely curious. "Really? I always wondered how you came up with such vivid situations. Some of them seem almost too fantastic to be real." "Oh, my dear, reality is often stranger than fiction," Dame Victoria chuckled. "Just last week, I was at a dinner party where a duke accidentally proposed to the wrong woman because he confused identical twins. It was like something straight out of one of my novels, except the real situation was far more complicated and embarrassing than anything I could have written." Queen Isabella laughed despite her nervousness. "That sounds absolutely dreadful for everyone involved. Did it work out in the end?" "Well, that's still unfolding," Dame Victoria replied with a conspirative whisper. "But I have a feeling it might inspire my next book. I'm thinking of calling it A Case of Mistaken Hearts." Lord Fitzwilliam cleared his throat discreetly nearby, indicating that the ceremony needed to begin soon. The Queen's palms grew slightly damp as she realized she still had no idea what she was going to say in her speech. Dame Victoria seemed to notice the Queen's renewed anxiety. "Your Majesty, is everything quite all right? You seem a bit pale." Queen Isabella hesitated for a moment, then decided to confide in the author. To be perfectly honest, Dame Victoria, I'm supposed to give the opening speech in a few minutes, and I'm completely unprepared. My notes have gone missing, and I'm rather at a loss for what to say about literature that would be both appropriate and engaging. Dame Victoria's face broke into a warm smile. Oh, my dear Queen, is that all? Literature is simply life with better dialogue and more satisfying endings. Why don't you just speak from the heart about what books mean to you personally? But I can hardly tell a room full of distinguished guests that I prefer romance novels to historical biographies, the Queen protested quietly. Why ever not? Dame Victoria asked with raised eyebrows. Some of the most influential people in history were hopeless romantics. Besides, there's nothing wrong with enjoying a good love story. They teach us about human nature, about hope, about the triumph of connection over adversity. The Queen considered this perspective as she watched the guests taking their seats. There were professors from the university, members of parliament, journalists, and other authors, all waiting to hear her thoughts on literature and its importance to society. Dame Victoria leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. You know, Your Majesty, I have an idea that might help you feel more confident about your speech. What if I tell you a little story that happened to me recently? It involves literature, unexpected romance, and a rather amusing case of mistaken identity. It might give you some inspiration for your remarks. Queen Isabella nodded eagerly, grateful for any distraction that might calm her nerves and provide material for her speech. Dame Victoria had a reputation for being an excellent storyteller, and the Queen found herself genuinely curious about what kind of real-life adventure the novelist had experienced. It all started 3 weeks ago, Dame Victoria began, when I received an invitation to what I thought was a book signing at a charming little bookshop in the countryside. I had published The Duchess's Secret Garden just last month, and my publisher had arranged several promotional events. This particular invitation was beautifully handwritten and mentioned that it would be an intimate gathering of literature enthusiasts. The Queen found herself drawn into the story, momentarily forgetting about her impending speech obligations. Dame Victoria had a gift for making even the simplest events sound intriguing and full of possibility. I drove out to the address on a lovely Tuesday afternoon, Dame Victoria continued. The countryside was absolutely gorgeous, with rolling hills and stone cottages that looked like they had stepped right out of one of my novels. I was already imagining how I might describe the scenery in a future book when I arrived at what I thought was the bookshop. Lord Fitzwilliam approached again, this time more urgently. Your Majesty, the guests are seated and ready for the ceremony to begin. Queen Isabella nodded to acknowledge him while gesturing for Dame Victoria to continue her story. Perhaps hearing about the author's recent adventure would provide some inspiration for her own remarks about literature and its connection to real life. Dame Victoria smiled knowingly and continued, Well, when I arrived at the address, I discovered that it wasn't a bookshop at all, but rather an elegant country estate. There were cars parked along the circular drive, and I could hear the sound of classical music drifting from the house. I thought perhaps the event had been moved to someone's private residence, which wasn't entirely unusual for author events in smaller communities. What happened next? Queen Isabella asked, finding herself genuinely invested in the outcome of Dame Victoria's story. I walked up to the front door with my box of books, assuming I was expected. A very proper butler answered, and seemed rather surprised to see me, but he was too polite to turn away a woman carrying a box of novels. He directed me to what he called the garden party and assured me that the family would be delighted to meet me. Queen Isabella couldn't help but smile at the image of Dame Victoria arriving unannounced at a stranger's garden party with a box of romance novels. It seemed like the beginning of one of the author's own stories. Dame Victoria's eyes twinkled with amusement as she continued. I made my way to the back garden, where about 30 people were gathered for what was clearly an elegant afternoon celebration. There were ladies in beautiful dresses, gentlemen in smart suits, and tables laden with delicious refreshments. Everyone seemed to be in wonderful spirits, though no one appeared to be particularly focused on books or literature. Didn't you realize you were at the wrong event? The Queen asked, genuinely curious about how such a mix-up could continue. "Well, that's where things became rather interesting," Dame Victoria replied with a mischievous grin. Before I could properly introduce myself and explain my presence, a lovely elderly woman approached me and said, "You must be Victoria. How wonderful that you could make it for Charles's birthday celebration. We've heard so much about your adventures." Queen Isabella realized that Dame Victoria had been mistaken for someone else entirely, but apparently had decided to go along with a misunderstanding rather than cause embarrassment for her hosts. Lord Fitzwilliam cleared his throat more insistently, and Queen Isabella knew she could no longer delay the ceremony. However, Dame Victoria's story had given her an idea for her speech. Perhaps she could talk about how literature and life intersected in unexpected ways, how stories could bring people together even in the most unusual circumstances. "Dame Victoria," the Queen said softly, "I'm afraid I must begin the ceremony now, but I would very much like to hear the rest of your story afterward. It sounds absolutely fascinating, and it's already given me some wonderful ideas for my remarks." "Dame Victoria nadie understandingly." "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll save the most amusing parts for later. I think you'll find that my accidental attendance at a stranger's birthday party led to some rather unexpected literary connections." Queen Isabella felt much more confident as she made her way to the podium. Dame Victoria's story had reminded her that the best literature often came from real life, from the unexpected encounters and mistaken identities that made life interesting. She decided she would speak about the magic that happened when stories and reality intersected, when books brought people together in surprising ways. As she looked out at the audience of distinguished guests, Queen Isabella felt grateful for Dame Victoria's timely story and her wise advice about speaking from the heart. The ceremony was about to begin, but now she had both inspiration and a renewed appreciation for the power of storytelling to transform even the most ordinary moments into something memorable and meaningful. Queen Isabella stepped up to the podium, her confidence bolstered by Dame Victoria's encouraging story. The ornate ballroom fell silent as distinguished guests turned their attention to their sovereign. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the assembled crowd of authors, academics, and literary enthusiasts who had gathered for the annual Royal Literary Festival. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished authors, and fellow lovers of literature, Queen Isabella began, her voice carrying clearly through the grand space. Today we celebrate something truly magical, the power of stories to transform our understanding of the world and bring us together in the most unexpected ways. She glanced toward Dame Victoria, who gave her an encouraging nod from her seat in the front row. The Queen continued, feeling more natural with each word. "Just moments ago, a dear friend reminded me that the most compelling stories often spring from real life, from those surprising encounters and cases of mistaken identity that could easily become the plot of a wonderful novel." The audience seemed engaged, leaning forward slightly to catch every word. Queen Isabella found herself relaxing as she spoke about her genuine love for literature and its connection to daily life. She talked about how books help people understand different perspectives, how stories could bridge gaps between cultures and generations, and how even the most unlikely situations could become the foundation for memorable tales. After concluding her remarks to warm applause, Queen Isabella made her way back to Dame Victoria, eager to hear the continuation of the birthday party story. The ceremony proceeded with various authors receiving recognition for their contributions to literature, but the Queen found her attention drifting back to the intriguing tale of mistaken identity. During a brief intermission, Dame Victoria approached the Queen with a cup of tea and a knowing smile. "Your Majesty, that was a perfectly lovely speech. You spoke beautifully about the connection between literature and life. Now, shall I continue with my little adventure?" Queen Isabella accepted the tea gratefully and nodded enthusiastically. "Please do. I'm absolutely dying to know what happened when you realized you were at the wrong celebration." Dame Victoria settled into the chair beside the queens as guests mingled around them, creating a comfortable buzz of conversation that provided privacy for their chat. Well, as I mentioned, this charming elderly lady had mistaken me for someone named Victoria who was expected at her grandson Charles's birthday celebration. Rather than embarrass the poor woman by correcting her immediately, I decided to play along for a few minutes while I figured out how to gracefully extract myself from the situation. "That was very kind of you," Queen Isabella commented, though I imagine it became rather complicated. "Oh, my dear, you have no idea," Dame Victoria laughed softly. The grandmother, whose name was Mrs. Hartwell, immediately began introducing me to various family members as Charles's Victoria from London. Everyone was absolutely delighted to meet me, and they kept mentioning things like, "Charles has told us so much about your work, and we're so glad you could finally visit the family home." Queen Isabella found herself completely absorbed in the story. "Didn't anyone notice that you were carrying a box of romance novels?" "That's precisely where things became even more amusing," Dame Victoria replied with a mischievous glint in her eye. Mrs. Hartwell noticed my box of books and exclaimed, "Oh, wonderful! You brought some of your publications for us to see." Before I could explain, she had gathered several family members around to admire what she assumed were my professional accomplishments. The Queen nearly choked on her tea. "She thought you were a different kind of author entirely?" "Exactly. It turned out that the Victoria they were expecting was Dr. Victoria Pembroke, a respected academic who had written several scholarly works on historical agriculture. She was Charles's colleague from university, and the family was very proud that their grandson was dating such an accomplished intellectual." Queen Isabella could hardly contain her amusement. "And they thought your romance novels were academic publications?" Dame Victoria nodded, clearly enjoying the memory. Mrs. Hartwell picked up The Duchess's Secret Garden and announced to everyone that it must be about historical gardening practices among the aristocracy. She began praising my thorough research into period-appropriate landscaping techniques, while several elderly aunts gathered around to examine the cover, which featured a rather passionate embrace between the Duchess and her mysterious groundskeeper. "Oh my goodness," the Queen gasped, trying not to laugh too loudly. "What did you do?" "Well, I realized I was in quite a predicament," Dame Victoria continued. "I couldn't very well correct them without causing tremendous embarrassment for Mrs. Hartwell, who had been so proud to introduce me to everyone. But I also couldn't continue pretending to be an agricultural historian when I knew absolutely nothing about farming techniques of any era." Queen Isabella was thoroughly entertained by Dame Victoria's dilemma. Around them, the other guests continued their conversations about various literary topics, but nothing seemed quite as engaging as this real-life comedy of errors. I decided to excuse myself to the powder room to gather my thoughts and figure out how to handle the situation gracefully, Dame Victoria said. On my way through the house, I encountered a young man who was clearly the birthday boy himself, Charles. He was about 30, with kind eyes and a slightly confused expression. "Did he recognize that you weren't his Victoria?" the Queen asked. "Not immediately," Dame Victoria replied. "He approached me very warmly and said, 'Victoria, I'm so glad you made it. I was worried you might not be able to get away from your research project.' I realized this was my opportunity to gently reveal the mix-up before things went any further." Dame Victoria paused to sip her tea, clearly savoring both the memory and the suspense she was creating for Queen Isabella. The Queen found herself leaning forward, completely invested in the outcome of this charming tale of mistaken identity. "I told Charles that I was afraid there had been a bit of confusion," Dame Victoria continued. "I explained that I was actually Victoria Ashworth, the novelist, and that I had arrived thinking I was attending a book signing at a bookshop. I showed him the invitation I had received, which had the correct address, but apparently belonged to a completely different Victoria." "How did he react?" Queen Isabella asked eagerly. "He was absolutely wonderful about it," Dame Victoria said warmly. Instead of being upset or embarrassed, he started laughing. He said it was exactly the sort of thing that would happen to his family, and that his grandmother had probably been so excited about meeting his intellectual girlfriend that she had misunderstood something Dr. Pembroke had said about the timing of her visit. Queen Isabella smiled at Charles's good-natured response. It sounds like he comes from a lovely family. Oh, they were all delightful, Dame Victoria agreed. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Charles asked me if I would mind staying for a little while as his guest, since his grandmother had been so looking forward to meeting me and would be terribly disappointed if I left immediately. He promised to gently explain the mix-up to her after I had gone. That was very thoughtful of him, the Queen observed. Indeed it was, Dame Victoria nodded. But then he said something that quite surprised me. He mentioned that he had actually read several of my novels and enjoyed them greatly. He said he particularly loved Moonlight at Montclair and thought I had a wonderful talent for creating believable romantic situations. Queen Isabella raised her eyebrows in surprise. How lovely. So he was familiar with your actual work. Yes, and that's when things took an even more unexpected turn, Dame Victoria said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Charles confessed that he had been meaning to contact my publisher because he had an idea for a story that he thought might interest me. He said his own grandmother's life had been full of romantic adventures during the war years, and he wondered if I might consider writing a novel inspired by her experiences. The Queen was delighted by this development. What a wonderful coincidence. Did you agree to hear his grandmother's stories? I did indeed, Dame Victoria replied. Charles suggested that rather than leave immediately, I might enjoy spending some time with Mrs. Hartwell and hearing about her younger days. He promised that she would be thrilled to share her memories, especially with someone who specialized in writing romantic fiction. Queen Isabella found herself completely charmed by the way Dame Victoria's accidental visit had evolved into a potential collaboration. It sounds like the perfect material for one of your novels. Oh, it gets even better, Dame Victoria said with a conspiratorial whisper. Charles led me back to the garden party and quietly explained to his grandmother that while I was indeed named Victoria and was indeed an author, I was actually the novelist Victoria Ashworth rather than his girlfriend, Dr. Pembroke. He suggested that she might enjoy telling me about her own romantic adventures from decades past. How did Mrs. Hartwell react to learning about the mix-up? Queen Isabella asked. She was absolutely delighted. Dame Victoria laughed. Instead of being embarrassed, she clapped her hands together and declared that it was fate that had brought a romance novelist to Charles's birthday party. She said she had always wanted to tell someone about her wartime love story, but had never found the right audience. Queen Isabella was thoroughly enjoying this tale of how a simple mistake had led to such charming consequences. Around them, the literary festival continued with various presentations and discussions, but nothing seemed quite as entertaining as Dame Victoria's real-life adventure. Mrs. Hartwell immediately insisted that I sit beside her for the remainder of the party. Dame Victoria continued. She wanted to tell me all about how she met her late husband during the London Blitz when she was working as a nurse, and he was a young officer on leave. According to her, their courtship involved secret meetings in hospital gardens, love letters written by candlelight during blackouts, and a rather dramatic proposal that took place during an air raid. That sounds absolutely fascinating, Queen Isabella said sincerely. The kind of authentic historical detail that would make a wonderful novel. Exactly what I thought, Dame Victoria agreed. Mrs. Hartwell had such vivid memories and told her story with such passion and humor that I found myself completely captivated. She remembered specific conversations, described the clothes she wore on important occasions, and even recalled the exact words her husband used when he proposed during that air raid. Queen Isabella could see why Dame Victoria had been so engaged by Mrs. Hartwell's stories. The combination of historical drama, genuine romance, and personal memory seemed like perfect source material for a compelling novel. But the story doesn't end there, Dame Victoria said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. While Mrs. Hartwell was telling me about her wartime romance, Charles mentioned that the real Dr. Victoria Pembroke was expected to arrive later that afternoon for a separate visit. He had apparently confused the timing when he invited her to his birthday celebration. Oh no, Queen Isabella gasped. So, the actual Victoria was still coming? Indeed, she was. Dame Victoria confirmed with an amused expression. And Charles asked if I would mind staying a bit longer to meet her, since he thought we might enjoy each other's company despite working in very different fields. He said Dr. Pembroke was quite interested in local history and might appreciate hearing Mrs. Hartwell's stories from a different perspective. Queen Isabella realized that Dame Victoria's simple case of mistaken identity was evolving into something much more complex and entertaining. She found herself wondering how the author had managed to navigate such an unusual social situation with grace and humor. Dame Victoria leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smile as she continued her tale. Queen Isabella found herself completely absorbed in the story, temporarily forgetting about the ongoing literary festival around them. The gentle hum of conversation from other guests provided the perfect backdrop for their private chat. So there I was, Dame Victoria continued, committed to staying for the arrival of the actual Dr. Victoria Pembroke, while simultaneously listening to Mrs. Hartwell's absolutely fascinating wartime romance stories and trying to take mental notes for a potential novel. I felt rather like a character in one of my own books, caught between multiple compelling storylines that were all unfolding at once. Queen Isabella chuckled softly. I can only imagine how surreal the whole situation must have felt. Did you manage to remember all the details Mrs. Hartwell was sharing? Oh, my dear Queen, the details were absolutely extraordinary, Dame Victoria replied with genuine enthusiasm. Mrs. Hartwell told me about how she met her husband-to-be when he was brought into her hospital ward with a minor injury from shrapnel. She said he kept making jokes to cheer up the other patients, even though he was clearly in pain himself. She found his sense of humor and kindness toward others completely irresistible. That sounds like the perfect foundation for a romance novel, Queen Isabella observed. The kind of authentic emotion that readers can really connect with. Precisely what I thought, Dame Victoria agreed. But Mrs. Hartwell's stories had layers that even I hadn't considered in my own writing. She described how their relationship developed through small moments, shared cups of tea during her breaks, conversations about books they both loved, and the way he would save interesting newspaper clippings to show her when she had time to chat. Queen Isabella found herself deeply moved by these glimpses into a real wartime romance. It sounds beautifully romantic, but also very grounded in everyday kindness. Exactly, Dame Victoria nodded. Mrs. Hartwell explained that they fell in love not through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of thoughtfulness and genuine interest in each other's thoughts and feelings. She said they discovered they both loved poetry, particularly the works of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and would quote favorite verses to each other during quiet moments in the hospital. The Queen was charmed by this detail. How wonderfully literary. I can see why you found her story so compelling. Indeed, Dame Victoria continued. Mrs. Hartwell told me about how her future husband would leave little handwritten notes for her to find during her shifts, sometimes tucked in a medical supply she needed, sometimes slipped between the pages of books she was reading during breaks. She kept every single one of those notes throughout their entire marriage. Queen Isabella felt a warm glow at the thought of such enduring romance. What a beautiful way to court someone, especially during such difficult circumstances. Mrs. Hartwell still had some of those original notes, Dame Victoria said softly. She went into the house and brought out a small wooden box that contained dozens of folded pieces of paper, yellowed with age but still perfectly preserved. She read me several of them, and they were absolutely beautiful, witty, tender, and full of the kind of genuine affection that makes the best romantic fiction. She shared something so personal with you, even though you were essentially a stranger, Queen Isabella marveled. That's precisely what made the encounter so special, Dame Victoria replied. Mrs. Hartwell said she had been waiting for years to find someone who would truly appreciate the romance of her story. Her own children and grandchildren had heard bits and pieces over the years, but she felt they saw it more as ancient history than as the passionate love story it had been. Queen Isabella understood completely. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to recognize the true magic in someone's experiences. Exactly, Dame Victoria agreed. Mrs. Hartwell told me that Charles had mentioned how my novels celebrated the kind of deep, authentic love she had experienced with her husband. She felt that a romance novelist would understand the significance of those small daily gestures that had meant so much to her throughout her life. As Dame Victoria paused to sip her tea, Queen Isabella noticed that Dr. Pemberton was approaching their corner of the ballroom. The Queen's private secretary looked slightly concerned, probably about some upcoming royal obligation that required attention. "Your Majesty," Dr. Pemberton said quietly, "I apologize for interrupting, but you have a brief meeting with the Education Minister in about 20 minutes. Shall I let him know you're running slightly behind schedule?" Queen Isabella glanced at Dame Victoria, torn between her royal duties and her desire to hear the conclusion of this charming story. Dame Victoria immediately understood the Queen's dilemma. "Your Majesty, please don't let me keep you from important matters," Dame Victoria said graciously. "We can certainly continue this conversation another time." "Actually," Queen Isabella said, making a quick decision, "Dame Victoria, would you mind terribly if Dr. Pemberton joined us for a few minutes? I think she would find your story quite entertaining, and I'm rather desperate to know what happened when the real Dr. Pembroke arrived at the party." Dr. Pemberton looked surprised, but pleased to be included. Dame Victoria gestured for her to take a nearby chair, and Queen Isabella quickly explained that they were hearing about a delightful case of mistaken identity involving two different Victorias. "How fascinating," Dr. Pemberton said with genuine interest. "Please don't let me interrupt the story." Dame Victoria smiled warmly and continued, "Well, just as Mrs. Hartwell was showing me the most romantic note her husband had ever written. It was a poem he composed specifically for her birthday during their courtship. Charles appeared with a tall, scholarly-looking woman who was clearly the real Dr. Victoria Pembroke. "Oh my," Queen Isabella said, leaning forward eagerly. What was her reaction to finding another Victoria already at the party? "Dr. Pembroke was absolutely wonderful about the whole situation," Dame Victoria replied. Charles had briefly explained the mix-up to her as they walked through the house, so she was prepared to meet her accidental replacement. Instead of being annoyed or confused, she immediately burst into delighted laughter. Dr. Pemberton smiled at this gracious response. "She sounds like a very understanding person." "Indeed she was," Dame Victoria agreed. Dr. Pembroke said it was exactly the sort of charming confusion that made life interesting. She mentioned that she was actually a great admirer of romantic fiction and had read several of my novels during her university years. She was particularly fond of The Scholar's Secret Love, which she said had helped her through some difficult times during her doctoral studies. Queen Isabella was delighted by this connection. "How wonderful that she was already familiar with your work. It gets even better," Dame Victoria continued with obvious pleasure. Dr. Pembroke explained that her own area of expertise was agricultural history, specifically the development of victory gardens during both World Wars. When she heard that Mrs. Hartwell had been sharing wartime memories, she became very excited about the historical context. "A perfect complement to the personal stories," Dr. Pemberton observed. "Precisely," Dame Victoria nodded. Dr. Pembroke was able to provide fascinating background information about the food shortages, rationing systems, and community garden programs that had formed the backdrop for Mrs. Hartwell's romance. She explained how couples during that era often bonded over shared gardening efforts and the challenge of creating beauty and abundance despite wartime restrictions. Queen Isabella found herself completely absorbed in how the different perspectives were weaving together. It sounds like the historical context added depth to the personal story. "Oh, it was absolutely magical," Dame Victoria said enthusiastically. Mrs. Hartwell remembered that she and her future husband had worked together in the hospital's victory garden during his recovery. Dr. Pembroke was able to explain the specific vegetables they would have grown, the companion planting techniques they might have used, and even the symbolic meanings that different flowers held during that time period. "What a rich foundation for a historical romance novel," Queen Isabella observed. That's exactly what all three of us were thinking, Dame Victoria replied. Mrs. Hartwell, Dr. Pembroke, and I found ourselves naturally collaborating on what could become a wonderful book project. Mrs. Hartwell provided the emotional truth and personal details. Dr. Pembroke offered historical accuracy and cultural context, and I could contribute the narrative structure and romantic storytelling techniques. Dr. Pemberton looked intrigued. Did you actually decide to work together on a book? We did indeed, Dame Victoria said with satisfaction. By the time Charles's birthday party was winding down, we had outlined the basic structure for a novel that would combine authentic wartime romance with accurate historical detail. Dr. Pembroke agreed to serve as historical consultant. Mrs. Hartwell committed to sharing more family stories and memories, and I would write the actual manuscript. Queen Isabella clapped her hands together softly in delight. What a perfect example of how unexpected encounters can lead to wonderful creative collaborations. But the story doesn't end there, Dame Victoria said with a mischievous smile. Because while we were discussing our potential book project, Charles made a suggestion that surprised all of us. What kind of suggestion? Dr. Pemberton asked curiously. Charles pointed out that his grandmother's wartime romance was just one of many fascinating love stories from that era, and he wondered if we might consider creating an entire series rather than just a single novel, Dame Victoria explained. He mentioned that Mrs. Hartwell had several friends with equally compelling romantic histories, and that Dr. Pembroke's research had uncovered numerous examples of couples who found love during wartime despite extraordinary challenges. Queen Isabella was enchanted by the expanding scope of the project, a whole series celebrating real wartime romances. Charles suggested that we call it Hearts and History and feature a different couple's story in each book, Dame Victoria continued. Mrs. Hartwell became so excited about the idea that she immediately began making a list of friends and neighbors whose love stories deserve to be preserved and celebrated. Dr. Pemberton smiled warmly. It sounds like a wonderful way to honor that generation's experiences while creating entertaining fiction. Exactly what we thought, Dame Victoria agreed. Dr. Pembroke was particularly enthusiastic because she felt the series would highlight the important role that everyday people played in supporting the war effort while maintaining hope and humanity during dark times. Queen Isabella checked the ornate clock on the wall and realized that her meeting with the education minister was approaching quickly. However, she was so invested in Dame Victoria's story that she hated to leave before hearing the conclusion. Dame Victoria, I'm absolutely fascinated by this collaboration you've described, the Queen said, but I'm afraid my schedule is pulling me away. Please tell me there's a happy ending to this tale of literary serendipity. Dame Victoria's eyes sparkled with satisfaction. Oh, Your Majesty, I think you'll find the ending quite delightful. But perhaps I could finish the story at another time? I wouldn't want to make you late for important royal business. Actually, Queen Isabella said with a sudden inspiration, would you both be interested in joining me for tea tomorrow afternoon? Dame Victoria could finish her story, and Dr. Pemberton might enjoy hearing the conclusion as well. I find myself quite invested in knowing whether your Hearts and History series comes to fruition. Both women accepted the invitation with obvious pleasure, and Queen Isabella found herself looking forward to learning how Dame Victoria's accidental attendance at a birthday party had ultimately transformed into a meaningful, creative partnership. As she prepared to leave for her meeting with the education minister, she reflected on how the day's events had perfectly illustrated her earlier speech about the unexpected ways that literature and life intersected to create memorable stories. The following afternoon, Queen Isabella found herself genuinely excited about her informal tea with Dame Victoria and Dr. Pemberton. She had chosen the palace's smaller rose drawing room for their gathering, as it felt more intimate and conducive to storytelling than the grand formal rooms typically used for official meetings. Dame Victoria arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested she had brought materials related to her story. Dr. Pemberton followed shortly after, looking pleased to have been included in what had become an unexpectedly delightful royal engagement. Your Majesty, Thank you so much for this lovely invitation, Dame Victoria said as they settled into comfortable chairs arranged around a small table laden with delicate china and an assortment of pastries. I've been rather eager to share the conclusion of yesterday's tale. Queen Isabella poured tea for her guests, noting how the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows created a perfect atmosphere for intimate conversation. I must confess, Dame Victoria, that I've been thinking about your story all evening. The collaboration between you, Mrs. Hartwell, and Dr. Pembroke sounds absolutely wonderful. Indeed it was, Dame Victoria replied, opening her portfolio. But I haven't yet told you about the most surprising development of all. May I continue where we left off yesterday? Please do, Queen Isabella encouraged, settling back with her teacup. Dr. Pemberton and I are both eager to hear how your literary partnership evolved. Dame Victoria smiled warmly and began. After Charles suggested expanding our single novel into a Hearts and History series, Mrs. Hartwell became absolutely unstoppable in her enthusiasm. She spent the rest of the birthday party introducing Dr. Pembroke and me to various family members and friends, asking each of them about romantic stories from the war years. Dr. Pemberton laughed softly. I can imagine how that conversation went. Excuse me, do you happen to have any fascinating love stories from the 1940s that might interest a novelist? You're remarkably close to the actual approach, Dame Victoria chuckled. Mrs. Hartwell had a gift for drawing people out with her genuine interest and warm personality. Within an hour, we had collected preliminary information about at least 6 different couples whose wartime romances sounded absolutely compelling. Queen Isabella leaned forward with interest. What kind of stories did you discover? Oh, they were wonderfully diverse, Dame Victoria replied enthusiastically. There was Mrs. Hartwell's neighbor, whose husband had courted her entirely through letters while he was stationed in North Africa. They fell deeply in love through written correspondence alone and didn't meet in person until after the war ended. How romantic and unusual, Queen Isabella observed. A completely epistolary courtship. Exactly, Dame Victoria agreed. Then there was Charles's great-aunt, who had worked in a munitions factory and met her husband when he came to repair machinery. Apparently, they bonded over their shared love of mechanical puzzles and engineering challenges. Their courtship involved him creating elaborate mechanical gifts for her, miniature working models of engines, and clockwork devices. Dr. Pemberton's eyes lit up with professional interest. That would provide wonderful insight into the industrial side of the war effort, particularly women's roles in manufacturing. Precisely what Dr. Pembroke pointed out, Dame Victoria continued. Each story offered both personal romance and historical context about different aspects of wartime life. We realized we could create a series that was both entertaining and educational, celebrating love, while also preserving important social history. Queen Isabella was impressed by the scope of the project that had emerged from a simple case of mistaken identity. It sounds like you discovered a treasure trove of untold stories. We certainly did, Dame Victoria confirmed. But here's where things took an even more interesting turn. As the birthday party was ending and Dr. Pembroke and I were preparing to leave, Charles made another suggestion that none of us had anticipated. What kind of suggestion? Queen Isabella asked curiously. Dame Victoria paused for dramatic effect, clearly enjoying the suspense she was creating. Charles pointed out that while we had wonderful material for our Hearts and History series, we were missing a crucial element: contemporary perspective on how these wartime romances had influenced the couple's entire lives together. Dr. Pemberton looked thoughtful. He wanted to include information about their marriages after the war. More than that, Dame Victoria replied. Charles suggested that we interview the surviving spouses and children to understand how wartime courtships affected long-term relationships. He felt that readers would be interested in knowing whether couples who fell in love during such extraordinary circumstances were able to maintain that connection during peacetime. Queen Isabella found this perspective fascinating. What a thoughtful approach. It would show the full arc of these relationships rather than just the romantic beginning. Exactly what we thought, Dame Victoria agreed. Mrs. Hartwell was particularly excited about this idea because she could speak from personal experience about how her wartime romance with her husband had shaped their entire 50-year marriage. She said the challenges they faced during courtship had taught them to appreciate small moments of happiness and to support each other through difficulties. That's such valuable insight, Dr. Pemberton observed. It would add real depth to the romantic stories. Dame Victoria nadie entusiastically. Mrs. Hartwell explained that couples from her generation had learned to find joy and beauty even in the midst of uncertainty and hardship. She felt this perspective might be helpful for modern readers who sometimes struggled with much smaller challenges in their own relationships. Queen Isabella was touched by this observation. There's something quite profound about learning resilience through love during wartime. Indeed there is, Dame Victoria agreed. Mrs. Hartwell told us that she and her husband had developed the habit of writing each other little notes even after they were married, continuing the tradition that had begun during their hospital courtship. She said they never stopped treating each other as though their time together was precious and not to be taken for granted. How beautiful, Queen Isabella said softly. The kind of lasting romance that many people dream of finding. Mrs. Hartwell's insights gave us the final piece we needed for our series concept. Dame Victoria continued. We decided that each book would include 3 elements: the historical wartime courtship, the accurate period context provided by Dr. Pembroke's research, and reflections on how those experiences shaped lasting relationships. Dr. Pemberton looked impressed. It sounds like a comprehensive approach to both romance and social history. We thought so as well, Dame Victoria replied. But Charles had one final surprise for us that completely exceeded our expectations. Queen Isabella raised her eyebrows in anticipation. What kind of surprise? Dame Victoria opened her portfolio and withdrew several sheets of paper. Charles revealed that he was actually a publisher who specialized in historical fiction and educational materials. He had been quietly listening to our entire conversation about the Hearts in History series, and he wanted to offer us a formal publishing contract on the spot. Oh my goodness, Queen Isabella exclaimed. He was evaluating your project professionally the entire time? Apparently so, Dame Victoria laughed. Charles explained that his publishing company focused on books that combined entertainment value with historical education. He felt our series would be perfect for his catalog because it honored real people's experiences while creating engaging fiction for contemporary readers. Dr. Pemberton shook her head in amazement. What are the odds that a case of mistaken identity would lead you to the perfect publisher for your project? Practically astronomical, Dame Victoria agreed. Charles said he had been looking for exactly the kind of series we had spontaneously developed. He wanted historical fiction that was both romantically satisfying and historically accurate, written by authors who genuinely cared about preserving important stories from the past. Queen Isabella was delighted by this perfect convergence of circumstances. So your accidental attendance at a birthday party resulted in a complete publishing partnership? It did indeed, Dame Victoria confirmed. Charles offered us a contract for an initial series of 6 books, with a possibility of expansion if the first volumes were successful. He also suggested that we include historical photographs and documents where possible to help readers connect with the real people who had inspired our fictional stories. What a wonderful way to honor those couples' memories, Queen Isabella observed. Dame Victoria smiled with obvious satisfaction. Mrs. Hartwell was absolutely thrilled. She said it felt like the universe had conspired to ensure that her generation's love stories would be preserved and celebrated for future readers. She immediately began making plans to contact her friends and organize what she called romance history interviews. Dr. Pemberton laughed at this charming phrase. I can imagine her enthusiasm for the project. Oh, she was unstoppable, Dame Victoria replied. Before we left that evening, Mrs. Hartwell had already scheduled 3 interviews with different couples and had convinced 2 of her neighbors to share their own collections of wartime letters and photographs. Queen Isabella was impressed by how quickly the project had gained momentum. It sounds like Mrs. Hartwell became your unofficial research coordinator. She certainly did, Dame Victoria agreed, and Dr. Pembroke proved equally enthusiastic. She offered to provide historical consultation for the entire series at no charge, simply because she was so excited about the opportunity to make her academic research accessible to general readers through romantic fiction. "How generous of her," Queen Isabella commented. Dr. Pembroke said she had always wished there was a way to share her knowledge about wartime social history with people who might not typically read academic publications, Dame Victoria explained. She felt that embedding historical information within entertaining love stories would reach readers who might never pick up a scholarly book about the 1940s. Queen Isabella found this approach quite clever. Fiction can certainly make history more accessible and emotionally engaging. "Exactly what we all believed," Dame Victoria replied. Charles was particularly excited about the educational potential of our series. He mentioned that several schools and book clubs have been asking for historical fiction that was both entertaining and factually reliable. Dr. Pemberton nodded approvingly. "It sounds like you had identified a real market need for your type of book." Charles certainly seemed to think so, Dame Victoria agreed. He explained that readers were increasingly interested in stories about ordinary people during extraordinary times. He felt that wartime romances offered the perfect combination of historical drama and personal emotion that contemporary audiences were seeking. Queen Isabella reflected on how Dame Victoria's simple mistake had evolved into such a meaningful project. "I'm absolutely fascinated by how one small mix-up led to such wonderful creative collaboration. Have you begun working on the actual books yet?" Dame Victoria's expression became even more animated. "Oh, Your Majesty, that's where the story takes its most delightful turn. We didn't just begin working on the books. We've actually completed the first manuscript and have discovered something quite remarkable about Mrs. Hartwell's own story." Queen Isabella set down her teacup with barely contained excitement. "Dame Victoria, you absolutely cannot leave us in suspense about Mrs. Hartwell's story. What remarkable discovery did you make?" Dame Victoria's eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of someone about to reveal a truly delightful surprise. "Well, Your Majesty, as Dr. Pembroke and I began working on the first book in our Hearts and History series, we decided to start with Mrs. Hartwell's own romance since we had the most detailed information about her wartime courtship." Dr. Pemberton leaned forward with interest. "That makes perfect sense as a starting point." "Indeed," Dame Victoria continued. "Mrs. Hartwell had been wonderfully generous with her time, sharing hours of memories about her relationship with her late husband. She showed us photograph albums, read us dozens of his love letters, and even took us to visit the hospital where they had first met, which had since been converted into a community center." Queen Isabella found herself completely absorbed in the narrative. How wonderful that the location was still accessible. "It was quite moving, actually," Dame Victoria replied with obvious emotion. "Mrs. Hartwell stood in what had once been the hospital ward and pointed out exactly where her husband's bed had been located, where the Victory Garden had flourished, and even the corner where they had shared their first kiss during a particularly loud air raid that had sent everyone into the basement shelter." "Such vivid personal history," Queen Isabella observed. "You must have felt honored to be trusted with such intimate memories." "We absolutely did," Dame Victoria agreed. "But as we were organizing all of Mrs. Hartwell's materials for our book, Dr. Pembroke noticed something unusual about the dates mentioned in some of the love letters." Dr. Pemberton looked curious. "What kind of dating inconsistency?" Dame Victoria opened her portfolio and withdrew a small stack of photocopied letters. Dr. Pembroke's expertise in historical timelines allowed her to recognize that some of the events Mrs. Hartwell remembered from her courtship had actually occurred during a different period of the war than she had initially indicated. Queen Isabella was intrigued. Was her memory simply unclear about the exact timing? "That's what we thought initially," Dame Victoria replied. But when Dr. Pembroke gently asked Mrs. Hartwell about the discrepancies, we learned something absolutely extraordinary. Mrs. Hartwell confessed that she had actually been married twice and had unconsciously been combining memories from two different wartime romances. "Oh my goodness!" Queen Isabella exclaimed. "Two separate love stories?" Exactly, Dame Victoria confirmed. Mrs. Hartwell's first husband had been a young officer she met in the hospital during the early years of the war. He had indeed courted her with poetry and love notes, and they had married in a beautiful ceremony when he was granted extended leave. Dr. Pemberton looked fascinated. What happened to that marriage? Tragically, her first husband was killed in action just 6 months after their wedding, Dame Victoria said softly. Mrs. Hartwell was devastated and threw herself into her nursing work as a way to cope with her grief. She told us she never expected to fall in love again. Queen Isabella felt her heart go out to the young woman Mrs. Hartwell had been. How heartbreaking to lose her first love so young. It was indeed, Dame Victoria agreed. But Mrs. Hartwell's story didn't end there. 2 years later, she met her second husband when he came to the hospital to visit wounded soldiers from his unit. He was a sergeant who had been temporarily assigned to liaison duties after recovering from his own injuries. The husband she had been married to for 50 years, Dr. Pemberton asked. Exactly, Dame Victoria confirmed. Mrs. Hartwell explained that her second courtship had been completely different from her first romance. Where her first husband had been poetic and romantic, her second husband was practical and steadfast. He courted her not with love letters, but with consistent presence, reliable support, and gentle humor that helped her heal from her grief. Queen Isabella was deeply moved by this revelation. What courage it must have taken to risk loving again after such devastating loss. Mrs. Hartwell said much the same thing, Dame Victoria replied. She told us that her second husband had understood her grief and never tried to replace her first love, but rather offered her a different kind of relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to helping others. Dr. Pemberton smiled warmly. It sounds like she was blessed to experience two very different, but equally meaningful kinds of love. That's exactly how Mrs. Hartwell described it. Dame Victoria agreed. She said her first marriage had taught her about passion and romance, while her second marriage had shown her the beauty of companionship and partnership. She felt that both experiences had been precious gifts, even though they were so different in character. Queen Isabella reflected on the complexity of Mrs. Hartwell's emotional journey, and she had been unconsciously combining memories from both relationships when she first told you her story. Apparently so, Dame Victoria confirmed. Mrs. Hartwell explained that as she had gotten older, the two sets of memories had begun to merge in her mind, creating what felt like one long, complex romance rather than two distinct love stories. She said she hadn't deliberately misled us, but had simply forgotten which details belonged to which relationship. Dr. Pemberton looked thoughtful. That's actually quite common with elderly people's memories, especially when dealing with emotionally significant events. Dr. Pembroke said much the same thing. Dame Victoria agreed. She assured Mrs. Hartwell that there was nothing unusual about the way her memories had blended together, and that the confusion actually made perfect sense from both psychological and historical perspectives. Queen Isabella was impressed by Dr. Pembroke's sensitivity. How did Mrs. Hartwell react to realizing what had happened? She was initially embarrassed about the mix-up, Dame Victoria replied, but then she became quite excited about the implications for our book project. She pointed out that we now had material for 2 complete novels rather than just one, and that her experiences offered a unique perspective on different types of wartime romance. What a wonderful way to look at the situation, Queen Isabella observed. Dame Victoria nodded enthusiastically. Mrs. Hartwell suggested that we write her story as 2 separate books that could be read independently, but would be even more meaningful when read together. She wanted to show readers that love could take many different forms, and that experiencing loss didn't prevent someone from finding happiness again. Dr. Pemberton looked impressed. That's quite a sophisticated literary concept for a spontaneous suggestion. Mrs. Hartwell was full of surprises. Dame Victoria agreed. She said she had always been a voracious reader and had often wondered why romance novels seemed to assume that each person only got one chance at true love. She felt that her own experience proved that hearts were capable of expanding to embrace different kinds of relationships at different times in life. Queen Isabella found this perspective both wise and deeply moving. What a profound message to include in your series. We thought so as well, Dame Victoria replied. Charles was absolutely delighted when we told him about the expanded scope of Mrs. Hartwell's story. He said that books exploring different types of love and the possibility of finding happiness after loss would have broad appeal for contemporary readers. I can certainly see the appeal, Queen Isabella agreed. Many people struggle with questions about love and loss in their own lives. Dame Victoria smiled with obvious satisfaction. Mrs. Hartwell has become something of a celebrity in her neighborhood since word spread about our book project. Several of her friends have asked if they can share their own stories, and we're now planning to expand our initial series from 6 books to 12. Dr. Pemberton laughed. It sounds like you've created quite a literary movement in Mrs. Hartwell's community. Indeed we have, Dame Victoria confirmed. Charles has been absolutely thrilled with the response to our first manuscript. He's already discussing marketing plans and has suggested that we consider organizing book tours where Mrs. Hartwell and other couples could speak about their real experiences alongside our fictional adaptations. Queen Isabella was impressed by how the project had evolved. What a wonderful way to honor both the historical period and the people who lived through it. That's exactly what we hope to achieve, Dame Victoria replied. Mrs. Hartwell says she feels like she's helping to preserve important stories that might otherwise be forgotten. She's particularly pleased that younger readers will learn about her generation's experiences through entertaining fiction rather than dry historical accounts. And how is the collaboration working between all of you? Dr. Pemberton asked. Dame Victoria's expression became warmly affectionate. Oh, it's been absolutely delightful. Mrs. Hartwell has proved to be a natural storyteller with an excellent eye for authentic detail. Dr. Pembroke provides historical context that enriches every aspect of our narratives. And Charles offers publishing expertise that ensures our books will reach the widest possible audience. Queen Isabella reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had led to such a successful collaboration. It's quite extraordinary how your simple mistake at the bookshop address led to such a meaningful creative partnership. I've thought about that many times, Dame Victoria replied. If I hadn't confused the addresses, if Mrs. Hartwell hadn't mistaken me for someone else, if Charles hadn't been both gracious about the mix-up and knowledgeable about publishing, none of this would have happened. Dr. Pemberton smiled. It really does sound like fate intervened to bring you all together. Mrs. Hartwell certainly believes so, Dame Victoria laughed. She says it proves that the best stories happen when people remain open to unexpected possibilities and treat strangers with kindness and curiosity. Queen Isabella raised her teacup in a small toast to Mrs. Hartwell's wisdom and to the magic that happens when literature and life intersect in the most delightful ways. Dame Victoria and Dr. Pemberton raised their own cups, and Queen Isabella felt a deep satisfaction in how perfectly Dame Victoria's real-life story had illustrated the points she had tried to make in her speech about literature, bringing people together in surprising ways. Dame Victoria, Queen Isabella said, as their tea gathering drew to a close, I cannot thank you enough for sharing this wonderful tale with us. It's exactly the kind of story that reminds us why literature matters so much in our daily lives. Your Majesty, it has been my absolute pleasure, Dame Victoria replied. And I do hope you'll consider reading our Hearts and History series when the first volumes are published. I think you'll find Mrs. Hartwell's stories quite compelling. As her guests prepared to leave, Queen Isabella found herself reflecting on how a day that had begun with her own literary mishap, the missing speech notes, had led to hearing about Dame Victoria's much more delightful literary adventure. She made a mental note to invite Mrs. Hartwell to the palace someday, as she would very much like to meet the remarkable woman whose openness to unexpected encounters had created such a beautiful publishing collaboration. The afternoon had perfectly demonstrated that the most engaging stories often emerged from the most ordinary circumstances, transformed by kindness, curiosity, and the willingness to embrace life's delightful surprises.